Ever since I first saw Obsession, I've wanted to talk about it here on the channel. It is an incredibly thought-provoking film with a surprising amount of profound insight into modern relationship struggles and our secular society's twisted perception of love. The movie has so much to analyze and extrapolate, but for a long time I felt like everything that I could have said about it had already been said in several of the countless video essays already made in the last couple months. What was there for me to add? I also found the conversation surrounding the film to be as interesting as the film itself, and I could have devoted a video to that, but again, there wasn't much I could say that I hadn't already seen others articulate perfectly, and so I almost didn't cover the film at all. Then, as usual for me, the idea for this video came not when thinking about this film or the reactions to it in isolation, but when I thought of the reactions to another film and made a surprising connection between the two. But before I get into what that connection is and why it matters, you should know that I'm just thinking out loud here, so if you like my brain vomit, you know where the like and subscribe buttons are. And also, because the films I'm going to be talking about involve such sensitive subject matter, and because people have such strong feelings about them, I want to make as clear as possible from the beginning that I do not condone the actions of the characters I'm going to be discussing, and I do take things such as sexual assault and suicide very seriously. So whether you agree with my interpretations and takeaways or not, I don't want to hear anyone in the comments accusing me of making light of such serious issues. In fact, I probably would have had this video out a whole week earlier had I not spent so long polishing the script to be as tactful in handling these issues as possible. So if I offend anyone watching, I sincerely apologize in advance and hope you'll recognize that was not my intention. Now without further ado, let's dive into what I find so interesting and also somewhat troubling about the conversation surrounding Obsession. The way audiences have reacted to the character of Bear is fascinating, because they've split pretty cleanly between those who see him as an irredeemable monster and those who see him as a blameless victim, and I find both sides miss the point of the film entirely. Now this video will focus on those who vilify Bear, in part because they seem to comprise the majority of the audience, and they present the more interesting phenomenon to me, but I want to take a moment real quick to make it clear that I am not defending Bear's moral character from criticism, as he is very much the villain. The film does not leave it particularly ambiguous as to whether his actions ought to be viewed in a negative light as the film goes along, and of the two camps of the audience, I feel the one defending Bear is easily the one having to stretch the script the most to fit their narrative. To all those who found him too relatable to condemn him for his narcissistic obsession, I'm afraid the film's entire message was meant for, but sadly lost on you. His shallow conception of love and his infatuation with the idea of Nikki as a possession at the expense of her happiness as a person create and perpetuate the entire horrific situation of the film. You can't argue otherwise without blatantly ignoring every piece of subtext in the film and many moments of overt text. However, while yes, Bear as a character can rightly be considered the villain of the story, I don't know that it's fair to describe him as a person as a villain, if that makes sense, because I'd argue he's no more evil than most ordinary people. Labeling him as a villain makes it all too easy to dismiss the themes of the story as not applying to us, and it allows us to attribute Nikki's fate to the psychotic whims of a narcissist rather than to a mindset that most of us likely often find ourselves too easily stuck in ourselves. Bear's a pretty normal person, and the thing that makes him the villain of the film, his objectification of others and view of relationships in terms of his own gratification rather than his partner's happiness, is something I think we all deal with to some degree, something our society pushes on us, and of which far too many of us are too often guilty. And getting to the crux of the video, if this character had that same fundamental flaw, that same selfish way of viewing others, but if it manifested in a cool, charismatic way rather than a sad, pitiable way, he'd likely have far more defenders. After all, how many rom-coms star suave womanizers just as objectifying and obsessive as Bear, but because they're played by Matthew McConaughey or Ryan Gosling, we all just say they're sad and broken, they're fixer-uppers that just need to meet the right person. But would they really be any different from Bear in the same situation? Or might they even be worse? See, while our condemnation of his mindset and actions is valid, I think we are so harsh and unempathetic, not so much because of the moral weight of his actions, but because we don't want to empathize with someone so pathetic. Female viewers find his complete and total lack of confidence or charisma to be completely unattractive, and thus aren't remotely inclined to be forgiving of his treatment of Nikki, while male viewers see him as the antithesis of everything they aspire to be, everything our culture demands they must be to be considered men. So they can't stand to see themselves in him and must put themselves on a higher moral ground. Now, while I think it's crucial to be able to empathize with Bear, to be able to appreciate the story's message and apply it to ourselves, I should again reiterate that, by the end, he does, at least largely, deserve to be treated as the villain of the story. However, this same phenomenon also sometimes leads us to vilify characters that don't deserve it, which brings us to the other case study of the video. I was honestly shocked to learn the degree to which everyone on the internet has agreed to hate Dear Evan Hansen, and I don't really understand it. In fact, if you hate this movie, I'd love for you to explain why in the comments. Now, this isn't going to be a defense of the movie as a whole. While I may think it deserves it, that's not the point of this video, so I'm just going to defend its titular character, who does seem to be at the heart of a lot of the film's criticism as far as I've seen. Whatever your reasons may be, you don't have to like the movie, but if you call Evan himself a manipulative sociopath who only cares about himself, I'm afraid you didn't even make a superficial attempt to understand or empathize with the characters, and I can't help but doubt that you even finished the film. Of course, I will acknowledge that if the tragedy of suicide is something personal to you, and thus the premise of the film and what Evan does over the course of it makes you deeply uncomfortable, I totally understand you empathizing more with the Murphy family than with the protagonist, and finding his actions too despicable to easily forgive. But I wouldn't consider that a fault of the film, because his actions are fully acknowledged to be selfish and ultimately harmful, and he doesn't expect their forgiveness in the end. He's a deeply flawed character who, like Bear, finds himself in a situation that seems too good to be true, and for much of the film, can't bring himself to give it up out of selfishness and cowardice. However, unlike Bear, Evan Hansen can only bear to take the advantage of this grieving family for so long. And by the end, he grows, and having learned what a real impact he can have on the lives of others, he turns outward to make a genuine positive difference in the world, whether or not it benefits him. This is not a character we are meant to despise, not at any point in the story really, but certainly not by the end. However, it seems most audiences did anyway, and whether they were put off by the light tone of much of the movie, just found his actions too personally appalling, or simply couldn't suspend their disbelief and accept Ben Platt playing a teenager, the way I've heard them describe his character reveals another common theme. After reading too many Letterboxd reviews, it seems most people just can't stand watching a character so sad, so timid, so cowardly and self-destructive, and they treat these qualities not as character flaws and obstacles to be overcome, but almost as moral failings that make him a bad person not worth pitying or rooting for. Now, for another important clarification, I don't want to strawman anyone here by lumping everyone who didn't like the movie or the character into a box, and assuming they're all just prejudiced against people struggling with mental health challenges like those depicted in the film. However, I have been shocked at how many viewers, seemingly by admission, made no effort to empathize with the film's protagonist because they just find such totally uncharismatic and deeply insecure characters disgusting. And as with those who paint Bear as a totally narcissistic monster, I can't help but wonder if it's because these people find characters like this too real, that they remind them of the parts of themselves they hate, that they try to hide, so they seek to dissociate from them by putting themselves on higher moral ground. So how about we do a little empathy exercise? I'm going to go through each of these characters' stories, and I want you to put yourself in their shoes. Honestly ask yourself what you would do in the same situation. Not what you like to imagine you would do, what the real you would actually do. Neither Bear nor Evan went out of their way to hurt others or pursue their own ambitions. They just found themselves in a position where the path of least resistance was to simply go along with a lie or illusion and allow themselves to be given what they always wanted, rationalizing and ignoring the harm done along the way. And the deeper they went, the harder it became to give it all up. In Bear's case, it was a while before he had any real idea what was going on. Something was clearly wrong that first night, but he expressed serious concern as a result and refused to take advantage of Nikki. Then the next day, he seemed to find a pretty reasonable explanation for her behavior, after which everything seemed pretty normal. And at that point, well, the girl of his dreams wanted him. He finally had the one thing he wanted more than anything else in the world. What, was he going to fight it? We may have known her love was magically induced, but he had no reason to suspect the supernatural, until that date night. And yes, at that point, he does make the most villainous decision of the movie by choosing to sleep with her, knowing that her love is the result of his wish. This undoubtedly proves he didn't truly love Nikki in any meaningful way, and there is no excuse for him here. But before you go accusing him of being a full-on rapist, let me just point out that while his actions here are extremely messed up and rightly framed as a dark turning point for his character, he still didn't yet know the real Nikki was a conscious prisoner in her own body. And when that revelation comes the following night, it does seem to shake him. Yes, he does his best after that point to try to get Demon Nikki to just act normal so he can pretend she's the real thing, seemingly demonstrating a lack of concern for her well-being. But remember, he did already try to cancel the wish and had been told the only way out was to kill himself. So can you really blame him for wanting to avoid that option? Besides, as the guy on the phone pointed out, as long as he was alive, he kinda had a moral obligation to be there for this person he essentially created. Even so, he did seem to finally accept that her love wasn't real and he couldn't pretend otherwise in their conversation after the party, only then staying because she threatened to kill herself if he left. Oh, and let's not forget that before that, he did try to get her some kind of help, as many suggest he should have done. We can't say how hard he tried or what he was willing to do for her without knowing what was said in that conversation outside the ER, but it's not as if he never made any attempt to get her outside help. And lastly, just to put this all in perspective in case it seems like he spent a long time as the villain of the story, let's all remember that only a day goes by between him learning the wish worked and him first trying to cancel it, and he spends that day in clear distress over how to handle the situation. Then, after trying to cancel it and learning that Nikki is a prisoner in her own body, he pretty quickly realizes he can't make the relationship work. And it is that same night that all hell breaks loose. Again, not that it justifies anything he says and does in that short period of time, and I believe you'd be right to argue that Bear's discomfort seems less the result of his guilt over violating her autonomy, and more the result of Nikki's sudden increase in frighteningly bizarre behavior and the dissatisfaction of knowing he doesn't actually have the genuine love of the real Nikki after all. I mean, you'd only have to point to his initial attempt to alter rather than cancel his wish, not to even mention his callous reply to her plea for him to kill her. I just want to make sure we recognize that he doesn't really spend that much time trying to make it work once it becomes clear what's going on. And he's certainly not deliberately trying to keep Nikki imprisoned. Now, if he had tried to alter the wish without canceling it after learning the real Nikki was trapped in her own body, then you'd have grounds to talk about him as if he was completely indifferent to her suffering. Now, you may personally get the impression that he would have still tried to avoid canceling the wish entirely had he already known how it worked at the time, and I think it's fair to say that his willingness to violate her free will before learning the full nature of the wish is plenty evil in itself. But I just don't want to make any unfounded assumptions just to make him seem worse than he already is. As I cannot make clear enough, I'm not a defender of Bear's total innocence in this situation. His faulty perception of love seemingly influences the way his wish is granted in the first place. He dismisses his friend's valid concerns that he is taking advantage of Nikki, and most disturbingly, his responses to her pleas for help are disgustingly self-centered. You could even argue that if he ever truly cared about Nikki for who she was as a person, he'd have noticed the drastic personality shift that accompanied her sudden infatuation with him long before she went full freaky Nikki. By most metrics, he is not a good person, but if you can't recognize the horrific nature of his no-win situation, identify some amount of his selfish tendencies in yourself, or honestly ask how similarly you'd have acted in his place, I'm afraid you haven't even tried to put yourself in his shoes, and likely haven't applied the film's message to yourself. Bear's not a villain because he's uniquely evil, but because he fell for society's lie that our personal happiness matters above all else, that relationships are but means for our own gratification, and that love is just a feeling or need rather than a selfless commitment. And anyone can fall for that lie. But in the case of Evan Hansen, you can't even say his motivations were purely selfish, as he was also scared of shattering the last shred of hope and happiness he'd given this family, as much as he was scared to lose what they'd given him. He wanted to tell the truth, but he couldn't bring himself to rip away the joy they felt at thinking they'd found a piece of their lost son to cling to. And the longer he went along with the lie, however well-intentioned it may have begun, the harder it became to come clean, something anyone should be able to understand. And then as the lie grew out of his control, he found something he never expected and certainly never went looking for. Purpose in something bigger than himself. The love of his peers. The family he never had. And even the girl of his dreams. How could he give all that up? And on top of that, he seemed to be doing genuine good for countless people beyond just this one family. Yes, it was built on a lie. Yes, it was largely selfish fear that kept him from making things right at any number of points along the way. But I'm confident that many people placed in the same situation would do the same thing. Probably most if they all had Evan's crippling social anxiety. And frankly, there's an interesting moral argument worth having here over whether his lie was even a moral wrong when it only seemed to do good for everyone involved for so long. but that's not the point of the video, so I won't dwell on that. But unlike with Bear, that's not where his story ends, because he comes clean as soon as the lie appears to be doing more harm than good. And after coming clean, he sets out to make things as right as he can by getting to know and sharing the truth about the real Connor Murphy, giving his family some authentic closure, and finally focusing primarily on others rather than himself like he had for most of the story. And in this selfless shift of focus, he finally gains some real peace and confidence, becoming a much better version of himself than the one we met at the beginning. I hope as I went through each of these character stories like this, you were able to find a bit more empathy and understanding for them. Not that I'm suggesting you should be okay with their character flaws or despicable actions. That's not what empathy means. I just hope you can see yourself in them a little more. Of course, that'll be easier for some than for others. After all, I'm sure I was able to connect with them so easily, in large part because I felt a lot in common with them. I'm generally quite shy and uncomfortable in social situations. I've often felt invisible and worthless, and I've certainly been lonely and desperately longed for intimate human connection. So when I see these traits emulated so perfectly in these characters, I have no trouble seeing myself in them and thus assuming the best intentions in their actions. But whereas most who relate to these characters seem to justify their moral flaws because they want to be seen on the screen but don't want to recognize their own faults, I see these characters and take the opportunity to introspect, to ask myself how much I really have in common with these deeply imperfect people and how I can improve to avoid their examples. That's the power of empathy, one of, if not the greatest tool of storytelling, and it's something I'm afraid too many of us are far too selective about implementing as audiences. And of course, the reason this matters is because it extends beyond our treatment of fictional characters and into the real world. For a particularly relevant example, those who most despise Bear's character don't just hate him, they hate anyone who relates to him. As if they need someone real they can attack to channel their hate, this massive portion of the film's most fanatic fanbase have swarmed anyone they can find online, not only who defend Bear's character, but who merely aren't as vitriolic and unempathetic in their disdain for him as they are. I've seen multiple YouTube channels now bullied into making essentially apology videos after saying nothing wrong in quite reasonable videos providing quite balanced takes on the film's characters and themes. This hate goes beyond anger at the opposing opinion and stoops to the level of making unfounded assumptions about people's character, accusing them of the same behavior committed by Bear, and making personal threats against them. Some level of this kind of behavior is to be expected on the internet, but the sheer volume and veracity of it in this specific case is shockingly real evidence of the exact lack of empathy I'm talking about, bleeding from our relationship with fiction into our interactions in reality. But what if this phenomenon works the other way as well? What if, while we're quick to judge and slow to empathize with characters that don't appeal to our deepest ideals, we're simultaneously slow to judge and quick to empathize with characters we want to be like, even when they demonstrate the same moral failings? And what if that bleeds into reality as well? As a stark counterexample to our previous two case studies, let's look at a character far more villainous than either Bear or Evan Hansen: Walter White. Throughout the 5 brilliant seasons of Breaking Bad, Walt does many horrible things, knowingly and deliberately. He treats human life as disposable and callously orchestrates horrific acts that leave countless lives shattered. But because he's cool about it, because he's powerful and competent and takes control of his life in a way many of us wish to, we forgive him, we try to assume the best in him, and we celebrate his achievements rather than condemn his character. And we even vilify those he victimizes to ease our conscience. Now, you may say any number of things in Walt's defense. Maybe that it's easier to root for Walter when he primarily hurts bad people. Maybe the majority of the harm he causes to innocents is far more indirect than anything done by Bear or Evan Hansen. Maybe the slow descent into villainy over the course of multiple seasons makes it easier to see him as a tragic anti-hero. Or, if you want to just ignore subtext in the last episode entirely, you could just say he did everything he did for his family. But maybe you can admit that he objectively does more harm to more people than Bear, and is ultimately a less redeemable character if all kinds of harm are considered equally. Maybe it's just that you consider the nature of Bear's actions, i.e. sexual assault, so much more disgusting. In that case, let me remind you of the one scene from Breaking Bad we all love to ignore. That's right, in case you forgot, Walter White is a rapist. Throughout the show, but evidenced most dramatically in this one particularly dark scene, He objectifies his wife, sees her only as a symbol of his status as a man and provider, and uses her for his own sexual gratification as he seeks to reassert his dominance in all parts of his life. But because he's such a badass, we conveniently blot this episode out of our memory of his character so we can love to cheer him on, all while we diminish the humanity and relatability of characters like Bear, who demonstrate the same corrupt conscience without providing any of the glorious wish fulfillment. We may talk about characters in terms of universal moral principles, but deep down, those principles aren't what really matter most to us, and more often than not, we just use them to justify and reinforce our worldviews and instinctive personal judgments. Whether or not we like to admit it, we enjoy watching and rooting for capable and charismatic people, good or bad, fictional or real, because we want to be like them, whereas pathetically relatable characters like Bear or Evan Hansen remind us of the real us, the kind of people we're terrified of being. So we despise them, and by extension, anyone who identifies with them to any degree. And because we don't want to admit to the insecurities driving these judgments, we look for moral reasons to justify them and simultaneously put ourselves on higher ground. As I must reiterate one last time as I wrap this up, I am not claiming characters such as Bear don't deserve moral judgment. I'm merely arguing they also deserve empathy. Just as cool villains like Walter White deserve both judgment and empathy. I fear we implement morality in our judgment too selectively in order to make ourselves feel better by fixating only on the moral failings of those we already want to consider beneath us. We vilify relatable characters we find pathetic because we don't want to see ourselves in them, and we glaze over the monstrosity of cool characters because we want to be like them. And this selective moral judgment speaks to what we really value and aspire to. However, it is only when we can apply both empathy and moral judgment to all characters that we can truly learn from them and begin to extend that same empathy to real people who need it. But what do you think about all this? How do you view these characters, and what do you make of most audiences' reactions to them? As always, I'm just here to kick off the discussion, and I look forward to joining you down in the comments. Though I should once again say, I'm not going to be engaging with anyone not interested in a respectful, good faith discussion. Of course, if you made it to the end without commenting already, I hope I can trust you there. So until next time, just keep thinking out loud.